My talk is about finding ways to meet that need in creative ways, and I want to start, though, by reviewing some of the important things about freedom and why it's such a big deal. This slide is based on data from an organization called the Fraser Institute, which is a Canadian public policy think tank. They, once a year, conduct a survey of all the countries in the world, and they rank them on what they call their Economic Freedom Index. This slide shows us across the x-axis, across the bottom, the economic freedom of all the different countries in the world, and along the y-axis, the average income of the people within those countries. So what you can see very clearly here is a strong positive correlation between the amount of economic freedom in a country and how much money the people in that country actually make. And you may notice that it trends up as well. It's relatively flat at the beginning, and then it starts to go up, and then it goes up sharply. What the graph illustrates for us is that as countries get more free, not only do people make more money, but they make more money more quickly. This next slide is about happiness, but first I want to talk a little bit about the methodology here. They divide the countries into 4 groups. The most free, can you hear me? Okay. The most free, countries that are more free than average, countries that are less free than average, and the countries that are the least free. So those are the 4 groups that we see charted here. And in happiness, you can see that the most free countries have the most happiness on this happiness index. And as you go down in freedom, people gradually report less and less happiness. Similarly for unemployment rates, the most free countries have the lowest unemployment rates, and as countries get less and less free, unemployment goes up more and more. Infant mortality, free countries have the lowest infant mortality by far. The environmental performance index, there's a bit of a myth that if you leave people free, they won't take care of the environment. It's not true. The freest countries take the best care of the environment. Life expectancy, you can live longer, expect to live longer in freer countries. Also, as it comes to civil liberties, your civil liberties are much better guaranteed in a free country. Here we see, to an extent, a repeat of the slide we saw before about income levels. But what's important to see here is that same trend, where the more free the country is, the more income you can make. And as you go down to less and less freedom, your income goes down further. Finally, you might think, okay, in rich countries, rich people make a lot of money, that brings up the average, etc. But even if we look at the income of the poorest 10% of all these countries, still, very often you would be better off to be a poor person in a free country than a wealthy person in an unfree country. Corruption as well, we have far less corruption in free countries. Child labor is coming up again. Okay, so if we look at the big picture here, there's all these different measures, and the more free a country gets, the better off you are. So it seems like everyone would want freedom, but it turns out freedom is a somewhat hard thing to get. I'll talk about that more in a minute. First, let's think a little bit about what freedom is. The Fraser Institute, who provided this data that I've been talking about, they identify 4 factors. First is personal choice, to what extent you get to make the decisions in your own life. Second is voluntary exchange coordinated by markets. That essentially means to what extent is the economy that you lived in planned by some central government versus planned by people who are actually trading together. Third is freedom to enter and compete in markets. This is essentially a lack of regulation. How easy is it for you to go into business without being hampered by regulations? And fourth is protection of persons and their property from aggressors, which is essentially having a good police force and a court system you can count on. To understand the significance of freedom, one thing that's helpful to think about is the relationship between freedom and entrepreneurs. entrepreneurs, in a fundamental sense, are people who create value for other people. And if they're good at it, they're really good at creating value for other people. We tend to think of entrepreneurs as being business people, and there are business entrepreneurs, but there are also social entrepreneurs who focus on solving social problems, educational entrepreneurs providing new ways to educate people and sometimes even finding ways to work around a broken educational system. There are health entrepreneurs, and to an extent, more and more, there are spiritual entrepreneurs, which, as Matt Ridley in his talk talked about ideas having sex and human society getting more and more advanced, as our standard of living improves, more and more of us are not busy hunting food or figuring out how to build shelter. We have higher aspirations, and these are the aspirations that are met by spiritual entrepreneurs. Something those of us in developed countries often lose sight of is what entrepreneurs really need. Michael Strong talks about something he calls the entrepreneur's toolkit. In an important sense, this is what people who are leaving less developed countries, risking their life to go to more developed countries, often what they're looking for is these two things. They're things that support entrepreneurial activity in general. The first one is secure private property. In many less developed countries, the private property system is so undeveloped that you don't even own clear title to your own home. If you don't own clear title to your own home, you can't get a small business loan because you don't have something to use for collateral. If you can't get a small business loan, it's very much harder to grow from a business that employs 1 or 2 people to something that employs 50 or 100 people. So property rights affect entrepreneurship in ways that we might not even think about, but they can be very insidious when they're not present. The second item in the entrepreneur's toolkit is the rule of law. Again, something we take for granted in developed countries, but there are many countries in the world where entrepreneurs and civilians are governed not by law, but by people. And so if you're in danger of some arbitrary fiat or some arbitrary decree rendering your company illegal or rendering you as an illegal immigrant, it makes it very difficult for you to plan for the future. It makes it very difficult to get investment funds. Investors of all sorts, including entrepreneurs, very much want to be able to predict the future, and if you live in a society without rule of law, that's very difficult. Why is freedom so effective? And by the way, are we going to reset the clock since I lost a couple minutes at the beginning? I hope so. Okay, why is freedom so effective? If you think about it, I've talked a little bit about elements of freedom. We looked at what the Fraser Index offers. Freedom is essentially about removing force from human relationships. You live in a free country to the extent that you know you can live there, you can do business there, you can interact with other people without someone using force against you. And what that does is it creates a society based on consensual interactions. If I can only interact with you through consent, that means I have to offer something of value if I want something from you. We have to exchange, mutual exchange to mutual benefit. That's how it works in a free society, which means if I want something from you, I have to become an entrepreneur. I have to learn how to solve problems that you have. So the beautiful thing about free societies is they create societies of entrepreneurs who become better and better at solving other people's problems. It's an amazing thing. This is a picture of some young children from Senegal. It's a country known for its entrepreneurs who often have to leave to go to countries where they can practice their craft. And unfortunately, every year, hundreds of Senegalese perish at the bottom of the ocean because they try to get in small boats to get to Europe. Given the many advantages of freedom, as I said, you might expect that everybody would want freedom in their country. But it turns out freedom is somewhat hard to obtain. And the reason for it at root has to do with the difficulty of getting over vested interests. Whatever regulations there are, whatever unjust laws there are, whatever prevents people from being entrepreneurial, some vested interest benefits from that. It may be an overlarge government, it may be the ruling class in your country, it may be a large corporation. it may be unions. These vested interests benefit from having those laws in place, and they're not going to give them up without a fight. So what do? It turns out one solution today that's particularly promising comes through cities. Cities offer a few interesting advantages. If we can't turn a whole country into a free country, very often we can turn a city into one. And the reason it works out well is because cities are large enough to offer the benefits of free trade. They're large enough to bring entrepreneurs together and let ideas have sex, as Matt Ridley called it. But they're also small enough that a lot of the problems can be solved more at the local level. You're showing up the same town hall meetings, you know each other. Some of the larger problems won't come up in cities that would in giant nations. And finally, it's relatively easy to create new cities compared to creating new countries. So my topic today is about free cities, and let's think for a moment about what is a free city. Usually, a free city begins on a piece of vacant land. It has some kind of coastline allowing you to build a port and conduct trade on an international level. And you start with excellent rules and institutions. I talked about the entrepreneur's toolkit. That's one of the first things that free cities start with. And finally, free cities typically have strong transparency for any government operations. Free cities, as I'm talking about, are still something that's very much being evolved and developed. But there are historical examples we can look at, one of which is in Dubai. Everything you see here, these skyscrapers, the city, the parks, the houses, some 30 years ago, it was just an empty tract of desert land. There really wasn't anything there. What they did was they set up an independent judicial administrative district with traditional Western property rights. They invited investors to come in and start investing in the infrastructure and creating jobs. By 2000, they had created a $17 billion economy right there where nothing had existed before. So when you do things right, you can make a lot of progress. A second example of something sort of a prototype, an early version of free cities, would be what China has done in their Shenzhen special economic zones. When China took back control of Hong Kong from Britain, they had a little bit of a problem on their hands in that most Chinese would rather be living and working in Hong Kong than being on the mainland. So what they did was they took some of what seemed to be working right in Hong Kong and they started introducing it in cities in Southeast China. Shenzhen was one of the first cities, and it's been very successful. It's created tons of jobs. A lot of the economic growth that we've seen in China in recent decades has come through these zones. Finally, I want to talk about the Honduras. This is a country in Central America, very much stricken by poverty. And they have experimented with the kind of free zones that we saw in China in the past. Over the past decade, they've started free zones that were more industrial zones. So there would be industrial parks where they invite in investors, and they were pitched to the Honduran public as a way to create jobs, and they were successful at that. They created more jobs than they were planned to create. They have recently passed a constitutional amendment, however, because they're going to try to take it to the next level. They don't just want to create the kind of freedom that gives you a job, because freedom ultimately is about more than having a job that you can drive to in an industrial park. What they want to do is create an entire culture within a city. This is a culture based not so much like what they did in Hong Kong, where you start off working in factories, but more the kind of culture that you would expect to find in San Francisco. They want a culture where artists and cultural creatives and entrepreneurs would feel very much at home. The project is new. It won't get started. I think they're supposed to break ground in another 6 months, but it has huge implications for other countries around the world who are looking for a way to bring some freedom into their own country and find a way to work around the vested interests that can make that so hard. So it's an early project. We don't know what the outcome will be. I personally am excited about it, and I wanted to share with you some of the background about freedom and about what they're doing in the Honduras so you can join me in watching what they're doing, seeing what we can learn, and hopefully being inspired by their success. If you'd like more information, we're putting together a new website at freecities.info. Thank you.